Looks like it's gonna rain on us.
It didn't rain on y'all out there.
It's all right. Yeah, this winter. What time? You know, off the roof of the cave.
Okay. How about let me do this? That'd be great.
Let's put stuff up that there. So we just throw it on the floor, lay it on the table.
This is weird.
Put it up where it's all.
It is
Gotta
not
work on it.
letting me edit the video
It ain't working.
or do anything to it. That's just weird. There we go. Sorry, y'all. I forgot to start the video.
Skip taking off a week.
So as we look at this, oh man, I did not mean to do that. But I can look at it here. So I was trying to figure out what we were going to do next. And so I decided on the epistles of John. And so I bought a commentary for it because I looked through my commentaries, my online commentaries, and I didn't have any. And I thought, well, then I haven't done it. And then Mom was looking at her Bible. She goes, well, I've got a few notes here, but there's nothing on these books. And so I came to the office this morning. I pulled it up, and sure enough, I have done it. And I did it in 2020, in June or July of 2020, when we were all locked down. And so it was that summer of being locked down that I did it. So it's been, almost 4 years, but I did not want to go back and do it. And so I decided to begin to tackle a book that I have always been kind of afraid to do. We started it in Lutheran Men, and then we bailed on it for a couple reasons. One, Jack Clark can't stand the Old Testament. And two, it was just kind of difficult. And part of that is the way that Lutheran Men Bible Study has worked. It doesn't give us the in-depth stuff behind it. And that's the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is obviously, it's probably the most important, if not one of the most important books of the Old Testament to Christians. But most Christians also don't know the book of Isaiah very well, including me, which is why it's difficult to handle. And the reason it's so difficult, the reason it is so important to us is because this is the prophecy that we typically go with and refer to as prophesying Christ. When like in the Old Testament prophecies that, let's see, do I still have them out? No, hang on. Let me get something out of here. Passion history. This is what, well, it doesn't matter. So from the Good Friday service, all of the prophetic words, make sure all of them, and I'm right with this. In fact, they're all from Isaiah 53. All of them are. So all of those are from the book of Isaiah. Every single one. The Easter readings. Advent readings from the book of Isaiah. And so what we feel is that this is a prophecy of Jesus, which it is for us as Christians. That, however, clearly is not the only way that this book is read or understood. And this is not how clearly Jewish people do not see this as a prophetic reading of Jesus, that the Messiah to come isn't Jesus, because that's why they're still Jews. But it is still an important book for them. Now, I want to begin by looking at a video, and I've shown y'all some of these before. I just think they're very, very well done. It's quick, it's easy. And it is the best way to it summarizes the book of Isaiah really quickly. So I'm going to start it. Oh, no.
Yeah, well,
Now I'm going to
Richard.
share my screen.
Give a shirt banana.
They redid the way this looks, and so well, now that's interesting.
Yes, it is.
Is it changing for y'all too? The way
Yes, you have a black screen behind you.
Well, that's because the layout is when I share my screen, you'll be able to see me. We'll do that later, just for fun. All right, here it is. And let me know if you can't hear it or see it.
The book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the latter half of.
Are you seeing this video?
No.
Leaders of Jerusalem and Judah. He spoke first of all a message of God's.
Okay. Let's try again. Hopefully this isn't one of those that won't let me. Okay.
Prophet.
All right, let's try this again. All right, are y'all seeing that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, as soon as I did that, it paused screen sharing.
The book of the prophet Isaiah.
Now, are you seeing the
Isaiah
video?
lived in Jerusalem in
Yes.
the latter half
Yes.
of Israel's kingdom period, and he spoke on God's behalf to the leaders of Jerusalem and Judah. He spoke first of all a message of God's judgment. He warned Israel's corrupt leaders that their rebellion against their covenant with God would come at a cost, that God was going to use the great empires of Assyria and after them Babylon to judge Jerusalem if they persisted in idolatry and oppression of the poor. But that announcement was combined with a message of hope. Isaiah believed deeply that God would one day fulfill all of his covenant promises, that he would send a king from David's line to establish God's kingdom, remember 2 Samuel 7, that he would lead Israel in obedience to all of the laws of the covenant made at Mount Sinai, remember Exodus chapter 19. And all of this was so that God's blessing and salvation would flow outward to all of the nations, like God promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And it's this hope that compelled Isaiah to speak out against the corruption and idolatry of Israel in his day. Now, the book has a pretty complex literary design, but there's one simple way to see how it all fits together. Chapters 1 through 39 contain 3 large sections that develop Isaiah's warning of judgment on Israel. And it all culminates in an event pointed to at the end of chapter 39, the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the people to Babylon. But in chapters 1 to 39, there's also a message of hope that after the exile, God's covenant promises would all be fulfilled. And chapters 40 to 66 pick up that promise of hope and develops it further. In this video, we're just going to focus on chapters 1 to 39. The first main section focuses on Isaiah's vision of judgment and hope for Jerusalem, and it begins as Isaiah accuses the city's leaders of covenant rebellion, idolatry, injustice, and God says he's going to judge the city by sending the nations to conquer Israel. Isaiah says that this will be like a purifying fire that burns away all that's worthless in Israel in order to create a new Jerusalem that's populated by a remnant that has repented and turned back to God. And Isaiah says that that's when God's kingdom will come and all nations will come to the temple in Jerusalem and learn of God's justice, bringing about an age of universal peace and harmony. Now, it's this basic storyline of the old Jerusalem purifying judgment into the new Jerusalem. This is going to get repeated over and over throughout the book, getting filled in with increasing detail. So, at the center of this section is Isaiah's grand vision of God sitting on his throne in the temple. And he's surrounded by these heavenly creatures that are shouting that God is holy, holy, holy. And Isaiah suddenly realizes just how corrupt he and his people Israel are. And he's certain that he's going to be destroyed by God's holiness, but he's not. God's holiness, in the form of this burning coal, comes and burns him, but not to destroy. Rather, it purifies him from his sin. And as Isaiah ponders the strange experience, God commissions him with a very difficult task. He is to keep announcing this coming judgment, but because Israel has reached a point of no return, his warnings are going to have a paradoxical effect of hardening the people. But Isaiah is to trust God's plan. Israel is going to be chopped down like a tree and left like a stump in a field. And that stump will itself be scorched and burned. But after all of that burning, God says that this smoldering stump is a holy seed that will survive into the future. It's a small sign of hope, but who or what is that holy seed? The rest of this section offers an answer. Isaiah confronts Ahaz, a descendant of David and a king of Jerusalem, and he announces his downfall. God says that it's the great empire of Assyria who will first chop Israel down and devastate the land, but there's hope. Because of God's promise to David, he's going to send after this destruction a new king named Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Emmanuel's kingdom is going to set God's people free from violent, oppressive empires. And Isaiah describes this coming king as a small shoot of new growth that will emerge from the old stump of David's family. It's this king that's the holy seed from chapter 6. And the king is going to be empowered by God's Spirit to rule over a new Jerusalem and bring justice for the poor, and all nations will look to this messianic king for guidance. His kingdom will transform all creation, bringing peace. Now, you finish chapters 1 through 12 with a pretty good understanding of Isaiah's message of judgment and hope. But when will this all happen? Isaiah saw another empire arising after Assyria, and that's Babylon, who would also attack Jerusalem and actually succeed in destroying it. And that brings us into the next sections of the book. So first, we have a large collection of poems that explore God's judgment and hope for the nations. We learn, first of all, of the fall of Babylon and Israel's neighbors. Isaiah could see that Assyria's world power would one day be replaced by the empire of Babylon, a nation even more destructive and arrogant. Babylon's kings claimed that they were higher than all other gods, and so God vows to bring Babylon down. And not only Babylon. Isaiah goes on to list Israel's neighbors, accusing them all of the same kind of pride and injustice, and he predicts their ultimate ruin. But remember, for Isaiah, God's judgment is never the final word for Israel or the nations. And that leads into the next section with a series of poems that tell a tale of two cities. There's the lofty city that has exalted itself above God and become corrupt and unjust. This city is an archetype of rebellious humanity, and it's described with language that's all borrowed from Isaiah's earlier descriptions of Jerusalem and Assyria and Babylon, all put together. This city is destined for ruin, and one day is going to be replaced by the New Jerusalem, where God reigns as king over a redeemed humanity from all nations, and there's no more death or suffering. These chapters are the climax to this section, and it shows how Isaiah's message pointed far beyond his own day. It was a message for all who are waiting for God to bring his justice on violent, oppressive kingdoms and bring his kingdom of justice and peace and healing love. The following section returns the focus to the rise and fall of Jerusalem. And first we find a whole bunch of poems where Isaiah accuses Jerusalem's leaders for turning to Egypt for military protection against Assyria. He knows this will backfire, and Isaiah says that only trust in their God and repentance can save Israel now, which gets illustrated by the following story about the rise of Hezekiah, king of Jerusalem. Just as Isaiah predicted, the Assyrian armies come and try to attack the city, and so Hezekiah humbles himself before God, and he prays for divine deliverance, and the city is miraculously saved overnight. But Hezekiah's rise is immediately followed by his fall. So he hosts a delegation from Babylon, and he tries to impress them by showing everything in Jerusalem's treasury and temple and palaces. It's clearly an effort to make another political alliance for protection. Isaiah hears about this, and he confronts Hezekiah for his foolishness. He predicts that this ally will one day betray him and return as an enemy to conquer Jerusalem. And we know from 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 that Isaiah was right. Over 100 years later, Babylon would turn on Jerusalem, come and destroy the city, its temple, and carry the Israelites away to exile in Babylon. And so all of Isaiah's warnings of divine judgment in chapters 1 to 39 lead up to this moment. He's shown to be a true prophet because it all came to pass like he said. But remember, the purpose of God's judgment was to purify Jerusalem and bring the holy seed and messianic kingdom over all nations. And it's that hope that gets explored in the next part of the book. But for now, that's what Isaiah chapters 1 to 39 are all about.
All right. So that is a broad overview of the first part of Isaiah. So what do you know about Isaiah, just out of curiosity?
It's written in poem form, poetic form.
Yeah. A lot of it is, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So did you hear what the two main themes are?
Mm-hmm.
Judgment and hope. Or as other people refer to, judgment and redemption, which is basically the same thing. Which incidentally is sort of the theme of the Old Testament, isn't it? I mean, you see that very specifically in the books of Genesis and Exodus, because of the way it's written. You'll see, it's cyclical. It starts out with God saying, hey, I created you, I love you. And this is what I need you to do. And the people saying, hey, we love you too. And then we're not going to do that. And the people screw up and God's judgment comes upon them. And then the people are like, we are so sorry. And then it rotates back around to, okay, I love you. I created you. Here's a new promise. And then people live for a while. This is great. And then they screw it up. And it just goes over and over and over again. And in some ways it happens like, it's sort of like, you ever see those rims that spin in the middle and then the bigger one spins on the outside? It's kind of like that, because it's the little spinning, like the little errors that they do, I guess, like, and that we do every day, right? Where we know what we're supposed to do. We screw it up. We say, well, we're not going to do that again. And then, life goes on and we screw it up again, kind of thing. But then you also see the bigger circle for the big mess ups that they do. And a lot of what Isaiah is dealing with is like the bigger picture screw ups of the entirety of Jerusalem, Israel turning his back on God. And so now one of the things that I've been seeing here is I don't know if y'all are aware of, I mean, you know about commentaries, but they're a little bit different. I mean, Hugh's career was based in science. You know, my mother, science and math teacher. I'm sure that when you're dealing with extermination of creatures, it's a pretty scientific endeavor, right? And the difference is, like, for the most part, when you're reading math and science books, for the most part, they agree with each other, right? Like 2 + 2 is 4 in every single math book.
Mm-hmm.
Not so with commentaries. And so what you've got is, because at the end of the day, everybody has their own personal hermeneutic. Hermeneutic, some of you heard me use that word before. That's sort of like your own theology, right? I mean, there's the overarching theology that we all have. You know, the big one is defined by the creeds. But then, like, the smaller you get, the more we all have our own sort of, you know, I think. And y'all have even heard me say before, this isn't Pastor Stephen speaking, it's Stephen speaking. And when I say that, I'm bringing my hermeneutic into it. I'm not bringing my own scholarship and all the other communion of saints into my argument. This is just kind of what I believe, right? Because we're all entitled to that. Well, I had probably one of the all-time best professors I've ever had. His name's Charlie Siegel. I took a class of his called, I think it was Gospels that he had. And so this was the first experience that I ever had like this, where we got a book. We had to pay for this book. And let me tell you, seminary books were not cheap. I'm sure they still aren't, but they were not inexpensive. Like, per semester, it was between $500 and $800 for books. And this was back in the late 90s. I have one book that was, what was it, $175. And it's this book right here, because I still use it. And here's why. You see that? Yeah. And then here's this side over here. Wait, wrong side. One side was in English and one side was in Greek. And I guess this was right, and it was so expensive because this was right at the cusp of when they would have to use different typesets to print it out. And so, you know, they'd have to get a Greek typeset to do this. And now I guarantee you this book now is half that price, because I mean, that's just a matter of changing a font. You know, I mean, it's easy to publish now. But at any rate, so we had this book for Gospels class. And again, I think it was Gospels class, that the entire time Dr. Siegel would take this book to argue against it. We would read this book for homework, and he would come back and tell us why this book was wrong. Which, I mean, it was a good learning experience, but still, I'm like, really? You made us spend money on this book that's garbage? I mean, you know, we can't use it now. I mean, you know, but so I got a commentary on Isaiah, that because there's actually a website called bestcommentaries.com, and you go to it and it's got them all sort of ranked by, you know, like how they rank them, but also like buyership and what, like, the readers comment on Amazon. Like, there's a whole system. But so I got like one of the top 3 of that, which I typically do. And so I start reading it, and what it says is something that I had not, the way I was taught Isaiah was very different concerning the authorship of Isaiah. Because I had always learned that Isaiah consisted of two or three different authors,
Yeah.
probably whose name were not Isaiah. Okay. For example, sorry, I'm pulling out another book. This is written by Christopher Seitz. Let's see what Chris says about the authorship of literary structure, historical structure. All right, this is just on first Isaiah. But you saw how it was split up, right? But how in that video, how it was split up into two different pieces. But second Isaiah is actually, some consider it second and third. And second Isaiah goes from 40 to 55, 56. And then the other one is like, I think it's 55 and then it's 56 to 60. Or no, however many, but there's like, it's split again. And so it was sort of thought that the first part that we will be focusing on, 1 through 39, because again, like we'll probably go back and do another book of Psalms and then come back and finish Isaiah. It's kind of what I'm thinking. And so the first part, chapters 1 through 39, were written by one guy. I say guy because in that day, women probably, most of them could not read or write. And then the second one came around and then possibly a third one, right? So because the thought was that it was written sort of from Babylon, of hope, because we're in the Babylonian captivity. Right? So the first part is pre-captivity, and the second part is during the captivity, and then the third part is post-captivity. But this commentator says, no, it was all written by one person. And he said something that sort of struck me. Because it's a prophecy. And I don't know if he said it this way or I just read it this way. Why are we saying that a prophecy can't be prophetic into the future? That's a good point. Yes, ma'am.
It would be interesting to know what Marty Stevens has to say about that, since she was an Old Testament seminary professor.
I can almost promise you she says it's in 3.
Okay.
Because that really is the prevailing thought. I mean, it truly is the prevailing thought that it is 3 authors. And it makes sense. I mean, but this guy does raise some good points. But again, once you get past in a commentary, once you get past the introductory parts, the way that it, like, then they're broken down by chapters and verses and things like that. Which is the meat of what you want in a commentary. The authorship and all that stuff, usually it doesn't come into play as much, because at the end of the day, who really cares?
Yeah.
These are the things that theologians argue, because that's all they know how to do. And they're typically college professors or seminary professors, and that's, that somebody has to argue these things. And so, pastors like me who read theology from time to time, but that's not our life. Our life is practical theology. This is for them to argue amongst themselves, which they love to do. But particular, the commentator that I have, which is in the top 3 of the commentaries, says that it is written by one person. And one of the reasons that he gave was that during the middle part, after the 39, after chapters 1 through 39, he begins to talk a lot about Babylon. And it sort of it sounds like he says the geography and like the stuff that went on didn't seem very detailed. You know, it didn't seem like he was actually there. There were things that one would assume that he would know that it doesn't look like he knew. And that raises, I mean, that does sort of call into question. I mean, it makes you think, you know, maybe it wasn't, but at the end of the day, again, who really cares? Because that's what this is. I mean, that's what this is. But another thing that we will be dealing with is, what does this mean to us as Christians? And at the same time, what did it mean to the people of Israel then? Because as Christians, we have a tendency to take the Old Testament and, well, we look at it through Jesus colored glasses, which we should. There is at our last roster leaders convocation, we had a theologian there, Amy Jill Levine. And Amy Jill is actually Jewish, which is important to note because, I mean, Mom said she struggled with Amy Jill Levine because, I mean, but Mom, you didn't see her in person, right? You were just reading her books.
We were reading her books and discussing it. And there were times that her Jewish commentary left me cold. I mean, she would get on a hobby horse and stay on it. There were lots of good things she said, but I sometimes got frustrated with her.
Well, it's when she's standing there in person, you don't forget she's a Jew. And again, that's part of you're probably not as used to reading commentaries and things like that challenge what you've always learned about Scripture, which, by the way, this is one of the challenges that pastors have of my generation. Not as much anymore, but like when they were teaching people and when we were teaching people about your parents' age, because when I started in ministry, that's a lot. I mean, just like if you look around the room now, who's here? Y'all were all at work when I started in ministry.
Right.
Okay. And so who would come to Bible studies? Your parents. All right. So if your parents were alive 25 years ago. But it was people in that age group. Well, over the past generations, the generation prior to my father of pastors, they were taught to read Scripture differently than we are. And my father's generation was sort of in between that. And it was a lot more literal back then than it is now. Because we sit there and I talk to y'all about, well, you know, the book of Genesis has 2 creation stories. And the point of Genesis isn't to say this is exactly how it is. It's to say that God created it all. Now, for a Baptist hearing this, that would be a struggle. 2-3 generations ago, for a Lutheran hearing that would have been a struggle. But y'all have heard enough of us saying this that you're like, yeah, that's how it is. But you know, we a lot of times in generations past, we would bump up against people that really, really struggled. And still, I mean, for those people who didn't grow up in you know, in a liturgical background. For those people, Joe Spires, for instance. I mean, Joe was a Lutheran, but he was a Baptist at heart. I mean,
Joe who?
Joe Spires, he died a few
That's some, is
Uh,
that somebody that's at your church? Was it your church?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
And God love him, but Joe was a Baptist. And if you asked him,
Absolutely.
that's what he would tell you. I mean, and in Bible studies, I mean, and Joe knew the Bible probably better than anybody I've ever met. I mean, he knew his scripture. But he also understood it in a very Baptist way. And so it could be challenging for him and for anyone in the class trying to navigate that. And so as we go through Isaiah, we are going to push back a little bit on the Christian aspect of this, and also try to look at it from their point of view. What does this mean? And does this mean to Jews now? What did it mean to them then? Because I think to fully understand Scripture, it's important not just to look at it from our standpoint, but also from theirs. Because what we know of the prophets, because Jesus tells us this, you know, a prophet is not without honor, is not without honor except in his hometown. And then, you know, the parable that we heard a couple weeks ago in church, Mom, I doubt you did, because we read this on Palm Sunday. Because we don't do Palm Passion here, because that's just laziness.
So what does that say about my church?
Well, yours and most of the other ones. I'm sorry. I think if you want to hear the story of Jesus dying, then you probably ought to show up the rest of the week. Just saying.
I agree.
But what I am saying with that is it's the parable of the landowner and the tenants, where the landowner leased his land to these guys, and when it was time to get paid, he sent people and they beat him and they killed him, and then he sent his own son. Well, the ones that the understanding is the ones that were beaten and killed were prophets. And so, you know, that's being a prophet was not something that you would want to aspire to be, quite honestly, because you were about to lose all your friends. The story of Jonah, whether or not it was a historical account, which we kind of lean against, because, you know, I mean, let's be honest, Jesus did some amazing things, but the supernatural of somebody living in a fish for a few days was not one of them. But the point of it was, Jonah was a prophet being sent to Nineveh, and he didn't want to go because he didn't want to have to tell those people that, and he really didn't think they deserved that message anyway. But, you know, because the people of Nineveh were screwing up, and the people of Israel, for one, they didn't really care because they didn't like the Ninevites anyway. But still, to have to go and deliver bad news is not fun. If you've ever had to fire anyone, you know this to be true. Even if you can't stand the employee, even if you know that they got to go, it is still not fun to fire somebody. And that's what the prophets were sent to do. They were sent to basically lay down the hammer. And what we see with Isaiah is he goes in and he lays down the hammer, but it's always coupled with hope. You know, this is what's going to happen, but here's a little hope. You know, here's a little piece of hope. Yeah, he always sort of, I guess, softened it. And what we also see from Isaiah is that the prophecy came true, as did the hope. And so, you know, the question with authorship is basically whether or not Isaiah was looking into the future. And many of us struggle with the idea that someone could look into the future. But that is the overview of what this book is about. I didn't want to start the book today before, and I basically, because of coming to the realization that I had studied First John, I didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare for this, as I then had to decide what in the world I was going to teach on, find a commentary, and then teach on it. So do y'all have any questions about Isaiah, or do you like, no, I don't want to learn about this book? Because if so, I've already purchased a commentary. It's a little too late, but and I've already started reading it, apparently. All right, so we will continue with the book of Isaiah next week. And I will see you all then. Well, some of you I'll see later today, some tomorrow, the next day. Most of you on Sunday. Bye.
All right, y'all.
Bye.
Have a good day.